Welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a treat for you. We are going to be discussing A Tale of Two Cities, a book which I absolutely adore. I think that every person ought to read at some time on their sojourn on this planet. And I want to make sure that you know that the discussion is awesome it's with Lindsey and Kim, and we get into some really incredible connections around the role of womanhood, the role of manhood, the concept of sacrifice, and how suffering sculpts us, and just some beautiful themes. But I want you to stick around to the end because we didn't talk about, we mentioned a couple principles, but I want to give you just five principles from the book and how I gleaned them using one of the tools I teach for finding principles, and that is to take a section or a quote that really speaks to you. So I've just gone through my book and found five places that I underlined and then analyzed them for a principle that lies underneath them. So I'll go over that with you at the end of the discussion, so stick around for that. In the meantime, if you would subscribe, like, share, leave a review, and send this off to a friend, I would greatly appreciate it. It will help us grow. Most importantly, it will help more people know about how the truth can make them free. So without further ado, here's the discussion, and stick around till the end for when I talk about some principles from the book. Thanks for joining us. All right, welcome back to the podcast. I am super grateful to be with Lindsey Wright and Kim Miner. They are such good sports when it comes to reading stuff and discussing it and thinking about it. They always have brilliant things to say. So we're going to be in A Tale of Two Cities. I've got to say it's in my top 10. And the first time I read it, I just wept and read it probably every 2, 3 years. Sometimes I listen to it. Sometimes I actually read the book, the words on the page, but just so worth your time. I'm going to start out by telling everyone that the people in my life who I have told to read this book have grumbled about the beginning of the book. So much so that I made a YouTube video about it. So I'm not going to talk here about what I talked there, but that YouTube will get you through the first few chapters because this book has the famous, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, one of the most famous novel openers ever. And it dives into some stuff that just doesn't seem to be like a novel and you can't really understand. And it is about two cities. It is about London and Paris. It's about England and France. And those are also symbolic of security and violence. And so anyway, we'll get into a lot of that, but go watch that video so that you understand what's going on in the first few chapters and then you can get into the story. I want to start just with a really quick, I'm not going to give you a whole big bio of Dickens, but this novel in particular was written later in his life, it was published just 11 years before he died. He had already had tons of success, married, had a bunch of kids, and at this time of his life, things weren't so hot. Like his marriage was, I mean, he separated from his wife while he was writing it, and he had fallen in love with an actress that was 27 years younger than him, and he was still thriving in his career as far as like having success. And always, always, always the great philanthropist who was starting public works. In fact, he started a shelter for unwed widows, a reform school for prostitutes. He helped start a theater that put on performances, free performances for the poor, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so he didn't just say we should reform society. He didn't just say we should care for the poor. He did it. He often did public readings and raised money. So he was a very good man in his own right, but his marriage was troubled. We don't know all the details about this relationship with this other woman, but it was not, in terms of his personal life, the happiest point in his life. And during all that time, he was writing this book. It was published, and the other really most important book written after this one was Great Expectations came next, and then a couple other novels, and then he passed away. His health started to decline. So that's kind of the place where we find Dickens. He's very active in his social reforms. As far as this novel goes, this is really fascinating because the book is published in 1859, and in 1855, he wrote to a parliamentarian named Layard, And he said this: I believe the discontent in England at the time to be so much the worse for smoldering instead of blazing openly, that it is extremely like the general mind of France before the breaking out of the first revolution, and is in danger of being turned by any one of 1,000 accidents. And then he cites a bunch of accidents that could happen. So 4 years earlier, it's already in his mind that England, especially London, is in a really turbulent place, and he is concerned about a revolution. He's concerned about the populace because he sees all the trouble, the social trouble, the distancing of the classes, all of that stuff. And so he's already made this connection that, oh man, I bet this is a lot what it looked like before the French Revolution. And in a lot of ways, this novel is a cautionary tale. He wrote it to his fellow British citizens to encourage them to look more carefully at how they were living and the things that could come if they didn't get their act together. So it was the current state of England and his fear of public riots and mob violence that motivated him to tell this story. One other little anecdote that plays into the kind of things that we see in the book and that we'll talk about. In 1849, he attended a public execution as he wanted to see the crowd's behavior at this public execution, and he was absolutely horrified. He says, I believe that a sight so inconceivably awful as the wickedness and levity, so the light-mindedness that was there of the immense crowd collected at this execution this morning, could be imagined by no man. And then he goes on to talk about all kind of the thieves, the prostitutes, the ruffians, the vagabonds, the whistlings, the brutal jokes, the faintings, all of that stuff was so unsettling for him. He finishes, when the sun rose brightly as it did, it gilded thousands upon thousands of upturned faces, so inexpressibly odious in their brutal mirth or callousness, so they were either so stone-faced and emotionally cut off, or just making light of it and didn't have any somberness of the occasion, that a man had cause to feel ashamed of the shape he wore and to shrink from himself as fashioned in the image of the devil. So these human beings were acting like devils in his estimation, and he was ashamed to be a human being at the way that they behaved during this execution. So he had some taste of this. He had something to say about it. He definitely wanted he wanted to do something socially. He was always driven by social situations and social needs. But in the meantime, he also tells stories about families and about virtue and about kindness and about generosity. And this book is no different. This novel is no different. It carries all those themes in it and several more that are quite, I would say this is probably next to A Christmas Carol, his most spiritually deep book that I've read from him. And so that's a backdrop to where we're at. We have some really powerful themes, some symbols, some characters to talk about. I'll take you just to the opening. Once you get past those first few chapters, the book opens up on a man named Laurie, and he's headed to Paris. He's headed to meet up with a woman in England so that they can go to Paris together. And she thinks she's an orphan, and he's there to tell her that she's not. And one of the major themes comes up early on as he dreams of himself saying, buried alive for 18 years, buried alive for 18 years, because her father has been imprisoned for 18 years. But I wanted to just put in a little plug. I know that some of this writing is going to be hard for some of you and you're going to want to shy away, but it's also really funny. So they're in this little inn. They're the only ones in the room. It's this 16-year-old man of business. And he keeps saying, he's never married. He's never had children. He's getting older. He's been a banker all his life. He's trying to be very clear. He's so afraid of breaking down that he's just trying to be real stone-faced and really direct with Lucy. She's the daughter. And he keeps saying, this is just business. We're just doing business, miss. But he's got to tell her that she's not an orphan and her father is actually alive. So you can imagine this sweet 18-year-old is just a mess, just can't even handle this conversation that they're having. So he's trying to be third-partied about it. So he's like, okay. suppose there was a case of a man and his wife died, and suppose that something happened to him, and suppose there was this child. And so then she says, the little child was a daughter, sir? And he says, a daughter, a matter of business. Don't be distressed, miss. And so then he goes on, if the poor lady had suffered so intensely. So then she falls down on her knees because she's starting to realize, this is my story. I am the daughter. My dad is not dead. So he starts in, he says, no, don't kneel. In heaven's name, why should you kneel to me? And then she says, for truth, oh dear, good, compassionate sir, for the truth. And he says, a matter of business. You confuse me. And how can I transact business if I'm confused? Let us be clear-headed. If you could kindly mention now, for instance, what 9 times 9 pence are, or how many shillings in 20 guineas, it would be so encouraging. I should be so much more at my ease about your state of mind. Dickens is the best. So that's the kind of, just you're crying and laughing all at the same time. Your heart is going out for Lucy, but you are also as hard as going out for Mr. Lorry. So such good stuff. So with all of that background, just few little things that you can plug away for when you pick up the book and read it, because you really need to pick up the book and read it. Maybe we could start by talking about some of your favorite characters. Who did you love and why did you love them? And that will give us a little bit of a framework to then start talking about the themes and the character development and the symbols behind who these people are.
I just personally can't stop thinking about Sidney Carton. I don't know if we want to bring him up right here at the beginning.
Yeah, of course.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
So Sidney Carton.
Yeah.
He's kind of this unvirtuous character. He's described as reckless and insolent and stays up late, out, drinks a lot, forever a bachelor. So he becomes friends. It's hard to explain if you don't know the story, but he is involved in saving. So we talked about Lucy, the daughter, and her father, Dr. Minette. He's been in the Bastille for 18 years. We see some of his recovery, some of the things that he has to deal with as he recovers from being dead and now being alive again. And Sidney is going to save this family 2 times.
Yeah.
He's a lawyer, so he's at a trial very early on. So Lucy falls in love with Charles Darnay. He's from France. He's an aristocrat from France.
Well, that happens after the trial. They've only met once on the boat.
That's right.
And he was a traitor.
That's right.
Being tried as a traitor.
Being tried in England, right? As a traitor.
Yes.
And they find out that he looks at.
They're called to witness because they were on the boat with him. They're called to witness in court.
Yes.
And Darnay is on trial.
Darnay's on trial, and come to find out, him and Sidney look a lot alike, enough to put doubt into the jury's mind that this is the man that actually did it. And so he kind of saves the family. Then
just by taking his wig off.
Just by taking.
Just being like, hey, could it be that?
Yeah. So he gets to be with this family just as
he becomes a family friend. I wrote down the characters' names and then I put page numbers when there were key descriptions about them. And I happened to have put a little tag here on, we don't have the same copies. So this is the very last phrasing of chapter 6, which I think is book 1. Okay. And it just says, this is after the case has been tried and he goes to dinner with Darnay and he's very clear about, I'm just kind of a scumbag. And Darnay's like, well, certainly you're not. And we're really grateful to you. And he's like, no, I kind of am. And then we meet Stryver that he works with and all of these kinds of things. And so then he's going home. It says, climbing to a high chamber in a well of houses, he threw himself down in his clothes on a neglected bed, and its pillow was wet with wasted tears. Sadly, sadly, the sun rose. It rose upon no sadder sight than the man of good abilities and good emotions, incapable of their directed exercise, incapable of his own help and his own happiness, sensible of the blight on him, and resigning himself to let it eat him away. So that's the picture that he paints for us early on of who Sidney Carton is. He's very bright. He's very capable, and he actually does care about people, good emotions. Like he has empathy. He's a good man in many ways, but he won't care for himself. He won't meet his needs. He won't overcome his faults. He won't address his addiction, and just has made whatever efforts and has totally given in to his weaknesses and is just letting himself kind of rot away. Because he basically works for a guy named Stryver, and he's the brilliance behind their partnership. So he does all the legwork, and Stryver gets all the glory because Carton won't go on his own and run his own
So
and
this
do his own court case.
this is what gets me,
Yeah.
because Sidney Carton is described as this he's lost interest in life, and we don't know
Yeah.
why.
Yeah.
But then Dickens does compare him to Stryver, who by all appearances is up and coming in society, is checking all the boxes. And it's very, very obvious from what Dickens, the words he uses, that Strider is not a good person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Sidney, I just, on the outside, does not look like a good person. Yet, at the end, he does the most selfless, he sacrifices himself for the good of another.
Yeah.
How?
No, but you
Yeah.
see it also
Yeah.
before the end in that conversation he has with Lucy. You see it a couple times before that, like who he actually is, right? And he just will not live up to it.
So
until the
is
very
he
end, like you're
actually
saying.
a virtuous person? How can you do something like that and sacrifice yourself, the good of another, without having trained yourself in virtue? Like,
Yeah.
does
That's a
that
good
make sense
question.
at all as a question?
Mhm.
I've been thinking about virtue a lot. I've been teaching a class about ancient Rome, and
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about virtue and revolutions, and so there's lots of connections to this book too. But even back to Aristotle and can virtue be trained?
Yeah.
Is it an education? And Sidney does not have an education in virtue, yet he's one of the best, goodest people
Bestest.
Bestest,
in
goodest.
the book. Sorry, that
Yeah. Yeah.
most good.
Yeah.
Okay, but the question also is like, besides maybe drinking too much, being indulgent in some of those ways, how is he not a virtuous person? Like, what other actions do we actually see him taking that are not virtuous necessarily? How do we, like I'm just like
That's a
trying
good
to,
point,
yeah.
because he takes care of his friends. He's
So
kind.
we don't know very much about how he lives his life.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if he's with women.
Yeah.
We don't know or prostitutes. Like we know that he is very ashamed of himself. We know that he does not aspire to reach his potential, which especially for this time and place was considered a duty. But from the standpoint of the educational tradition and the rigors of virtue, that's what virtue is reaching for your potential, right? So he's lazy and decadent and dirty and addicted, but he also has tender feelings.
Yeah.
It says that he goes to the Darnay's home, but not often. He comes and he sits and he watches and he leaves, but that their daughter adored him and she was adept at reading character. And so there's, I guess, I don't know obviously I don't know all the answers, but a couple of my thoughts would be he was an honest person. He did not try to cover his sins. He did not try to pretend to be something he was not. He had no false pride or ego about him at all. And he knew what he was and who he was, and he knew that he wasn't reaching his potential, but he also did not try to pull anything over on anybody. and was completely honest and upfront about everything.
Mm.
And that is a very key virtue that even some of the best people struggle with, with their own. He didn't have any false pride.
Mm.
And I would also say that what we do know is that those years that he wandered to their home and took in their company was shaping him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that he chose to be with people that he didn't even feel worthy of because their influence on him was positive.
Mm.
And that, I think, in a sense, is choosing, to some degree, choosing virtue. And we also don't know how much it tempered his behavior outside their home. We know he didn't give up his kind of slovenly, decadent ways in many regards, but they were definitely his people, and he was a man of enough integrity that nobody was going to touch his people, and he was going to do whatever needed to be done to preserve. I guess part of what I would say, as far as what you're saying, is that part of what Aristotle says is that education's job is to help us like what we ought to like and dislike what we ought to dislike. And what we do know about Carton is that he does recognize the good, the true, and the beautiful, and he does give them credence. So he does call them what they are. He does know what they are. He does definitely clearly understand the difference between right and wrong, and recognize and at least worship the good, the true, and the beautiful, who, in this instance is Lucy. But then through the verses quoted at the end, we see he lifts his sights beyond her, which is a very symbolic experience, which we can talk about when we get to the feminine and womanhood and all that kind of stuff in a minute. But so I don't know. Those are just some thoughts. I do think in some sense, they are having impact on him. In some sense, he is becoming a better man through their company and influence. And the best part of him is unwilling to let go of that or let that be damaged, Anyway.
Yeah. I think one of my biggest takeaways from just pondering about this character who seems to contradict himself sometimes, and that for me, I'm Sydney Carton.
Yeah.
I have flaws and weaknesses, and yet what am I at my core? And do I show up when it counts? And, like you said, all these things, am I honest? Am I surrounding myself with good people, good literature? So for me, it gives me hope that even despite my failures and weaknesses, that I can rise to the occasion and become who I am, who I'm meant to be.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I'm right there with you too. And my son read this a few months ago, and I mean, he just can't stop talking about Sydney Carton. He's writing college essays, and Sydney Carton's making his way in there. I mean,
What's he talking about? What stood out to him? Do you know?
I mean, I've kind of asked him that, but it's just like the impact at the end of the book on the reader of literally giving your life. I don't know if he knows everything about it. I think it's somewhat akin to you seeing kind of himself in Carton. He's one of those people that tends to be very hard on himself and think he's not capable of whatever. And so I don't know all the things, but it has had a lasting impact.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it makes me think too of like, I know in the MDM Academy that there's the video that you have on willing versus willful.
Yeah.
And it does, that's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, is the idea of being willing. And I think that we see that in a lot of ways in him,
Yeah.
right? In Sydney, and some of these ways where he's kind of an addict, which is just what it
Yeah.
is oftentimes, right? It's much more difficult to be willing in those areas, but there's lots of areas in his life where he's just willing, and I think that that's what leads,
Hmm.
you know, to
Yeah.
what he's able to do.
Yeah.
Great connection.
Yeah. I would say for me, one of the character, I just really love Mr. Laurie so much. And I feel like that, and again, we're going to talk about kind of, you know, the feminine and all of that, and Lucy and Mrs. Defarge and their polar opposites and
Mm-hmm.
all of that. But this family really humanizes him. He
Yeah.
really, and until he gets drawn into their story, which is so dramatic, even though he's just been this banker and it's just all about business and the bottom line, the story is so intense, so dramatic, so key that they draw him in. It's so like just brought me to tears at the end when he was like, you know, thank God that I have come to understand what family is, basically, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I thank the good Lord that I know what it means to be a friend and to be a pseudo grandpa and all of that, to experience family, because he didn't have any of that. And he's just so humble, so genuine, so funny, so quirky, and in his own ways also so devoted, and does also sacrifice himself in very
Yeah.
real ways
Mm-hmm.
for these people that he loves so dearly. And so anyway, I think he's awesome.
He
Yeah.
is a good character.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of like being a virtuous person, you really see that in all that he does.
Mhm.
You know, he really is trying to live his best he can all the time. And
Yes.
it's so great because yeah, at first, like you were reading at the beginning, you see him just focus on business and business. And then you just, his arc, just to see him emotionally invest in the family and what happens at the end and everything, and just really see just such a change in him.
Yeah.
It's pretty great.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I really love the why can't I remember his name now? The dad that was in prison for
Dr. Minute.
Dr. Minute.
And,
Yeah. You know, he was in prison, came out and just had all this trauma, right? Just
oh yeah.
it
Oh,
just took so much time and loving care of these people around him to bring him back to life, right? Like
yes.
reclaimed life. Like one
Yes.
of the main themes of this book
Yeah.
is just the recalled to life and reclaiming him as a person. But even still, there's like these moments, like when Sydney asks for Lucy's hand, not Sydney,
Darnay.
Darnay asks for
Mhm.
Lucy's hand, and we see
Mhm.
him regress, right? We see him go
Yes.
back to making his shoes, and we see him for a while, it just like rocks his world, you know, but he just has so much trauma and has had so much suffering. But just the turnaround he makes at the end and the change in him when they get to Paris at the end and they're trying to save Darnay.
Yeah.
And it says, I love this like seriously so much. It says, for the first time, the doctor felt now that his suffering was strength and power. For the first time, he felt that in that sharp fire, he had slowly forged the iron which could break the prison door of his daughter's husband and deliver him. And just that idea that he just like turned his suffering into strength and power, and that he knew that he could be the one that could actually, I mean, he didn't ultimately end up being the one, but he just, you know, put aside all this trauma and all this thing that he had gone through and just stepped up in the time that he needed to and used his suffering for good. And it's really amazing. Like, I love that with his character.
Yeah, that's beautiful. One of the things I wrote down was just the theme of suffering, how suffering sculpts us and strengthens us and softens us, allows us to turn around with greater empathy and
Mm-hmm.
Some of
succor
us.
others. Yeah, I mean, I guess it can
It's
harden you.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
Madame Defarge.
that's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. We get both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, but I do think, I remember Audrey in one of your podcasts, you talking about so often in our society that people use trauma as a crutch, right? To be less and to do less. And that really we have all these diagnoses and this is who I am now and this is what I am. And
Labels. Yeah.
yeah. And we don't necessarily we see the opposite in the doctor, right? Part of the theme is being like with Lori and like Mr. Lori and with Sydney, exposure to these people who are so good and virtuous that it changes them, right?
Yeah.
You see this, just how much Lucy sacrifices so much of herself to help her dad come back to life. And then you have Darnay come in and he's just a good, solid man. And these virtuous people help to transform each other. Really, I mean, let's be honest, right?
I recently read a short story by Mark Twain called The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg, a story about virtue. His main point in there is that virtue untested isn't actually virtue. It's these challenges and trials that we go through that strengthen our virtue. Dr. Minette had these horrible 18 years in the Bastille, mistreated and unfair and everything, right? And it's those trials and things that strengthen us. So in a way, can we be grateful for the hard things in our life because they're actually testing our virtue, which is strengthening our virtue. It's virtue.
What I always think about with that is Betsy's fleas. It's just, that's always, always in the hiding place when they're in the camp, and she prays and tells Corey that they have to thank God for the fleas. And Corey's like, you're absolutely insane. What in the world are you talking about? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. And then sure enough, the fleas were the reason that they were able to bring people to Christ and teach the word of God, because
he can use all things.
They wouldn't go back there because there was fleas.
Well, and the bad things for our good. It's just amazing.
Yeah. And there's like in the opposite page of where I was just reading, there's another quote here that says, that kind of talks about that. He became talking about Dr. Minette, he became so far exalted by the change that he took the lead and direction and required them as the weak to trust him as the strong.
Yeah.
And that he was the weak, and he depended on them so much. And through his suffering, he became the strong. And we see that too. I mean, scripturally based in that idea, as we yoke ourselves with Christ and things like that, we can change those weaknesses and become strong.
Well, and to your point,
sorry.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Just interesting connection between leadership and suffering. Like maybe good leaders have also suffered. Because you have to be tried by those fires. Anyways, go ahead, Audrey.
I mean, this is like this is far more superficial, but the other day Blaine was like, well, because we're like, I don't know, it feels a little bit like coming up from the ashes, restarting the podcast and being on a new platform and all of that stuff with the projects that we're working on. And he was like, well, I saw a stat the other day that the average successful business has failed 4 times before they've succeeded. So there is also something to be said for the business leader who is a good business leader, has been through the fire. They failed 3 times before they succeeded. And going through that suffering and through that struggle, it did strengthen them. And
if you approach it the right way, it teaches you the lessons that you needed to learn.
Yeah. Because I think it's partly because we butt up against life wherever our weaknesses are exposed. If we can partner with God properly, then that's the opportunity to shore that up, because that's a problem for us, because that's a problem for us. That's a problem for me because that's a problem for me. It would be a problem for somebody else. It's a problem for me because of who I am. But what you were saying, Kim, made me think, like, to your point about the willing versus willful. By the time you get to the end of the novel, basically, that Dr. Manette and Mrs. Defarge went through virtually the exact same experience, having their lives poisoned and spoiled by the exact same people and the exact same experience, event. And he chose, I mean, at first he was vengeful, which is why it all comes down and he can't save Darnay, right? But it somewhere inside them, there was that little piece of them that was just them that got to choose if they were going to be bitter and vengeful or if they were going to be soft and forgiving. And nobody else can unlock that but you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the feminine for a little bit and this Mrs. Defarge versus Lucy and the motherhood, womanhood element of this. We just for those that have been listening to the podcast for a while, we did one on the truth and beauty. And while we were reading that one, I don't think he mentioned this book, but I can't remember why we were in it or we thought of it. And anyway, as we got into it, we realized there were a lot of connections there, a lot of themes around what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a mother? And how is the feminine and femininity playing out in this novel? And the more times I read it, and the more times I think about it and look at it, like the more I see. It's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the two main ways we see it, right, is between Lucy and Madame Defarge. We've kind of loosely talked about Lucy a little bit, but haven't mentioned Madame Defarge. So, Lucy is the daughter of Dr. Manette. She's the one who gets him from prison and then that marries Darnay, right?
Well, and pause there real quick, because I love what it says about her. She's with Mr. Lorry. They're going to go get her dad. He says, we're going, I to identify him if I can, you to restore him to life, love, duty, rest, and comfort. And I think that is a feminine role. That is something that the feminine does, is to restore humanity to life, love, duty, rest, and comfort. Anyways.
That's awesome.
That's beautiful. Well, and I think that too, since we're talking about it, we can talk about Madame Defarge in a minute, but since we're talking about it, I think that what Sydney, and like characters keep mixed up in my head, what Sydney goes to her at one point and basically says, like, I love you and I would love to be with you, but I know that I'm not worthy of you, essentially. And I know that there's these other people that are pursuing you, and I think you should be with them, right? And so he's talking about his character, and he says, and I read this just because I think that those things that you had mentioned, Lindsey, have in the feminine has the power to do these things, right? So he says, in my degradation, I have not been so degraded, but that the sight of you with your father and of this home made such a home by you has stirred old shadows that I thought had died out of me. Since I knew you, I have been troubled by a remorse that I thought would never reproach me again. And I've heard whispers from old voices impelling me upward that I thought were right, that I thought were silent forever. I have had unformed ideas of striving afresh, beginning anew, shaking off sloth and sensuality, fighting out the old abandoned fight, a dream, all a dream that ends in nothing and leaves the sleeper where he lay down. But I wish you to know that you inspired it.
Yeah. And so then doesn't he make her a promise there as well? He says, if you ever need anything, I would get anything for you. And
so at the very end of the chapter, yeah, he kind of says that. And then he says, oh, Miss Manette, when the little picture of a happy father looks up in yours, when you see your own bright beauty springing up anew at your feet, think now and then that there is a man who would give his life to keep a life you love beside you.
So there it is.
There's the foreshadowing for sure.
Yes, but also
a man who would give his life, but yeah.
Yes, but also that he has enough integrity to keep that promise. That it wasn't rashly said. That he did mean it, and that when it came due, he paid. He paid on that promise. She didn't ask it of him. He gave it freely, but it called for the best in him.
Yeah. You see that, some of the things that he says, like, the way that she cares for others, the way that she loves others, the way that she
Yeah.
keeps her home. Some of these, what we would consider more feminine virtues, transformed him in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. He says he wanted to start anew. He wanted to look more upward and be more.
Yeah.
And that was so transformative for him.
Yeah.
I think that's why women are referred to as the gatekeepers of morality, the guardians of virtue, is because true femininity does inspire that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a couple things that I made connections around this time. I watched a little video on YouTube and then I was kind of going back and review it. So of course we know that there are characters, symbolic characters, right? There's the Moses or the this or the that, you know. So in this particular novel, this isn't the only interpretation, but Lucy pretty much exemplifies the Christ figure in the sense that she is the one that is perfect from the beginning. She doesn't need any character development because she's always the woman that she should be. We don't really see any transformation in her. She is the light that everyone looks to. She is the center that everyone hovers around. In terms of some of those symbolic traits that we attach to Christ, she represents those. She calls forth the best that's in everyone. She leads by example. They want to be better because of her influence. All of those things, she holds them together. And whereas Madame Defarge is, and this was something I hadn't made this, even in our previous conversations, I hadn't made quite the same connection. If you think about it, remember all the times when Mr. Defarge he compliments his wife like mad. Like he totally emulates her. Like she is totally on a pedestal for him. And he just thinks she's the most amazing woman that ever lived. And in a very real way, what's going on, I mean, she's the one that's knitting. She's the one that knows. She's the one that's making the record of everything that's going on and all the people that they're going to hurt. She's the expert that he defers things to. And even he has moments of weakness, of quote weakness, where he wants to give in to his more tender, tendencies, like to his empathic, to his humanity. And she dissuades him, like she hardens him back up. And there is a sense of power in anger and resentment. That's why people hang on to it. And so because he's been wronged and because they've partnered in this, he attributes his ability to continue to move forward in the cause to her greatness, in the same way that everyone around Lucy sees her greatness as what drives them and helps them become more and do the hard things and be inspired and all of that kind of thing. And then you see that reverberating impact. Like, for example, so she's the head of the women. And when they finally, near the end of the novel, go out to like wreak hell, she says, women, follow me, and I'm going to be your guide, and I'm going to show you like how to kill into excellence. And so then she says, to me, women, cried Madam, his wife, what? We can kill as well as the men when the place is taken. And to her, with a shrill, thirsty cry, trooping women variously armed, but all armed alike in hunger and revenge. And then they go out as Grim Reapers and they wreak all their havoc. And then it says this a few pages later. Not before dark did the men and women come back to the children, wailing and breadless. Then the miserable bakers' shops were beset by long files of them, patiently waiting to buy bad bread, and while they waited with stomachs faint and empty, they beguiled the time by embracing one another on the triumphs of the day. And then it goes on to say, fathers, it says, scanty and insufficient suppers those, and innocent of meat, as of most others sauce to wretched bread. Yet human fellowship infused some nourishment in the flinty viand, blah, blah, blah. Fathers and mothers who had had their full share in the worst of the day played gently with their meager children. So it's this really distorted view of mothers and fathers and women and motherhood and womanhood, of the kind of example they take their older children along with them and encourage the worst side of them in bloodthirsty killing, and then they come home and act like everything's normal and fine. It's so demented. But it's this counterbalance weight of Lucy's perfection and Madame Defarge's devilishness. And one other thing with that they also mentioned, which was so fascinating, is this theme. We can get into some symbols here in a minute. The symbol of the thread and the knitting, because I didn't remember that the title of book 2 is called The Golden Thread. So Lucy is the golden thread. She's the one that connects and brings to goodness all of those people. And then at the same time, you have Madame Defarge and her women knitting and knitting and knitting this thread of evil, or this thread of good, this golden thread or this black thread that weaves through the lives of the people around them. And this one woman bringing about such good or bringing about such evil. And in a real concrete way, Lucy connecting the good and Madame Defarge connecting the bad. So really so fascinating. I mean, I've read it several times. I never got all that, but
well, and this is kind of a tangent, but there's a third perspective that Dickens brings in about family and about the roles of men and women, and that's the aristocracy. In France. And this line, it's talking about motherhood. So you've got all the rich women and men together. He has this phrase, the leprosy of unreality, like they're all so detached from reality. But this is what he says specifically about the aristocratic mothers. Indeed, except for the mere act of bringing a troublesome creature into this world, which does not go far towards the realization of the name of mother, so just having a baby maybe not makes you a mother, there was no such thing known to the fashion. Peasant women kept the unfashionable babies close and brought them up, and charming grandmamas of 60 dressed and supped as 20. So Lucy's kind of in the middle. She just has this beautiful, virtuous family. On one side, we have the aristocrats that are totally separated from reality. It's not fashionable to be a mother. Like, it's sometimes you have to do it, but then you just give the baby somebody else to take care of. And then on the other side, you have the Madame Defarges and those people who are like you just talked about, that are going back and doing these horrible atrocities and bringing that back to the family. So it's interesting that these different ideas of the family, of motherhood, of femininity, weaved through the whole story.
Yes. And what's, I think, fascinating is, were you to ask these women that were following Madame Defarge, they would have told you that they do it because they're mothers and because they're women and for the good of their children and future generations. And they're fighting the evil with their swords and they're willing to do whatever it takes. And yet it's so evil and ugly and
what
distorted.
Are they teaching? What the education of virtue is. So those children are going to grow up. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
So what do you guys think is the difference then? Because we see that Lucy and Madame Defarge both have these like hard childhoods, right? Like dad goes to prison, mom ends up dying before she's even 18. Madame Defarge and that whole thing with her family, and we find out it ended up being Darnay's family that killed someone in her family or something like that, right?
It was her sister?
It was her sister that,
her sister was raped by Charles.
Right.
Yeah, it was her
uncle.
sister that they took advantage of.
Yeah. So they both kind of have like these traumas, like suffering, right? So what is it that makes the difference in the two? I mean, I don't know that I know. I'm honestly asking what you guys think, because two experiences that end up in just such polar opposite places, right? So much light, so much darkness.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of people that are in prison that had terrible childhoods and they had parents in prison, and that cycle perpetuates for sure. But I don't know. I think we spend an inordinate amount of time making excuses for people because of how they were raised. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Oprah Winfrey's not my favorite person, but she had a pretty terrible childhood. And she didn't go perpetuate that behavior. She turned it around. She became something completely different.
Yeah.
And are we the agents of our lives or not? Can we choose a different path or not? And how much responsibility are we willing to lay on the shoulders of any of us? I don't know. And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard because, especially because to me, like the biggest problem is when children are violated because it distorts their reality to such a deep core level. It is such a struggle. And I'm not the one standing there at the judgment day. Like I don't have any idea how responsible these people are for their choices. I don't know if they could have made a different choice. But I mean, like John Adams, he's got a son that's a president and he's got a son that's a drunkard having affairs on his wife who eventually commits suicide. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. It's the same guy, it's the same parents, it's the same.
Mm.
The upbringing was a little bit different, like John Quincy did spend more time with his dad when Charles was raised by the grandma and grandpa a little bit, didn't see his dad as much when his younger formative years. But in the end, the same biology, the same family, the same values, the same virtues, and very, very different choices are made.
Yeah. In the end, resentment is a choice and forgiveness is a
Mm-hmm.
choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to make a lot of difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that Charles Darnay was influenced by his mother. So he's an aristocrat. His uncle's pretty bad. Does these bad things, and it's his mother that finds out about it and tries to make amends, and that changes him.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, good point.
she's willing to,
Because she's
because of her
part of that
virtue.
group and she's kind of callous and she doesn't always get it. And she doesn't, but when it gets to a point and she knows it's wrong, she has the strength of character to call it out. That's a great point.
Yeah, I like this line. So this is Charles Darnay's mother. I would do all I can to make what poor amends I can. So she's trying to make up for what her husband and her brother-in-law have been doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Charles Darnay will never prosper in his inheritance otherwise. I have a presentiment that if no other innocent atonement is made for this, it will one day be required of him. She's trying to break the cycle. She knows that it's hard to break that cycle, and it makes he's a good man.
Yeah. Another
But also,
foreshadowing.
he has to be responsible for that too. He's had to make choices too, right?
Yeah.
But it helps.
Yeah.
Who you're surrounded with.
Yeah. But Charles never really made any of those choices. He got out young enough that he never was involved in some of the things that his uncle and things were doing.
Yeah, the choice to leave.
Yeah,
he made the choice to leave. He didn't want to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Madame
we always have that
Defarge is
choice.
Oh, what?
We always had that choice.
Yeah. But Madame Defarge, she just wants to keep stoking the fire.
Yeah. Yeah. She wants that sweet revenge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, before we finish up, let's talk just for a minute about this life and death, redemption and resurrection. While you ladies were talking, I had one kind of thought that I'd never had before about this theme. And there's a lot to it. There's Jerry. I mean, there's like a lot to it.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that cadences I hadn't noticed before is that we begin the book with a man who's been dead, Dr. Manette, and he's brought to life. And we spend the book with a man who's dead, Sidney Carton.
Mm.
And at the end of the book, he's brought to life. Because what is life?
Through his death.
Yes.
So
yes.
Ironic,
yes.
Is that the word?
Yes. What's the word?
Is it ironic? It might not be, but
yeah. I'd never thought about that cadence, that opening and closure that makes such beautiful bookends for what is life, what is death, what is it to be alive. He felt more alive in the last 24 hours of his life than he had his whole life, maybe since he was a young child. And then will receive life through his death. You know what I mean? Like, anyway.
Yeah, at the end, he's walking around the city saying, I am the resurrection and the life.
He doesn't even want to drink.
And he comforts that young girl that's standing
Oh,
next to him as they're waiting to get guillotined. I mean, just.
Oh, I know. It's so beautiful.
It does feel, I don't know the word, because it's like, oh, Sydney, you're actually finally the guy we all knew potentially that you could have been or would have been.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't you do it before? Right? It feels terrible in that way, almost a little bit, because it's like, oh, but ultimately, he becomes that person so he gets sacrificed for them, which is really, really beautiful, like in a lot of ways. But you're like, oh no,
yeah. And he just needed that big enough reason. And I think it's a challenge for all of us to have a big enough reason to strive to meet our potential. I mean, that's why, why should I work that hard? And you can't just like anything we say we want, you just can't appreciate how incredible the blessing will be if you were to really give your life for something. He loses his life to find it. It's just Christ's promise.
Yeah.
And what was the motivation? It was love.
Yeah.
That's the big enough reason.
Pure love. Yep. And the academy and all that stuff. Like it's just all about love all the time. It's just we talk about it all the time. And can you love yourself enough? Can you love God enough? Can you love other people enough through your actions? Anyway, what other thoughts about life and death, reclamation, being reclaimed, redemption, resurrection, those kinds of themes throughout the story do you want to touch on?
Well, I think you see it. There's like the Paris set of people, and there's the England set of people, right?
Yeah.
I think with the England set of people, most of them, except for maybe Lucy, right? You see this idea of being reclaimed, like becoming more alive and becoming more and better in who they are, right? Like you see it, like you said, like Mr. Laurie, you see it with Sydney, you see it with Jerry, who we haven't really talked about. The Dr. Manette, like all of these people, you see this more with Dr. Manette. It's literally being reclaimed to life, but you see life come into so many of them and them start to live a more full life and a whole life. And because like Mr. Laurie, all business, but then you see him open up and love and give and serve. And so I think that there's that element in just a lot of the characters.
That just made me think, Kim, like, because I was thinking of like Mrs. Pross too, and
Yes.
the devoted servant who just worships Lucy, and I was just thinking they just made a little heaven for themselves. That little group bought into each other to such a deep level. They just treated each other as, I don't know. I mean, they couldn't have treated each other better. Like they just the utmost respect and regard and attention and kindness and softness and unconditional love and devotion and dedication. And they all went up, they knew their roles, they knew their job, and they each were trying to do those to the best of their ability. And then they saw the good in each other and they pointed out the good in each other and they rose together and just created this little heaven on earth. And really, like the Defarges were creating hell. Like they were just digging themselves deeper, digging a catastrophe, a total social wide catastrophe for themselves.
And I love that that's the prescription that Dickens is giving to us. I think this book is a warning and a prescription, a warning about, we could, like you said at the beginning about England, we could be heading this way of the French Revolution, which did not turn out well.
Yeah. For a long time.
So here's the warning. And he points out, here's some of the things that the seeds of rebellion and the seeds of revolution. And it would be so interesting to compare the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the Roman Revolution and what made the American Revolution so successful. That's a tangent. What I wanted to say is that it seems to be that his prescription for what to do about it is centered in these ideas of family, home, virtue, creating that
Yes.
heaven
Yes.
that we see with this sweet family.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so true. That's a really good point, Lindsay.
Strong families are it may be a big part of the answer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So is that the prescription?
Maybe. I think at least a prescription.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of things we didn't talk about, the class struggles, and we didn't talk, what do you do about poverty, and what do you do about these other things that are happening? But
It'd be interesting to discuss this and using the conflict divisions.
yeah.
What's the connection you were thinking of?
Well, I mean, I remember in conflict divisions, he talks about the Revolutionary War and the way that now I can't remember the two different visions.
Yeah.
What are they called?
Constrained and
Oh, they
unconstrained.
each reflected the different visions. That's
Yeah, it's like
right.
the
So
unconstrained.
we have the constrained and the unconstrained in these people.
Right. And so you see like the unconstrained of the revolution, and you see the constrained, and you
Yeah.
know, some of the things that societally were going on and that the people believed and things like
Yeah.
that. It would be interesting.
Great point. Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. If we could do something to make our own family stronger, then we just can't know. Lucy didn't know what she was doing to make the world a better place. She was just loving.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can do more of that, person by person, it'll be a little bit better place. Well, Lindsay and Kim, thanks for joining me. Everybody else, thanks for listening. Go ahead and send us thoughts, put them in the comments, what your takeaways from this book are, lots of other symbols we didn't touch on, lots of other character strengths and arcs and all that good stuff. But we hit on some really important stuff. I really hope you'll pick it up. I hope that you'll dig into it. I hope you'll take the time to let it nurture your soul, because it will. And it will make you, by the time you're done, want to be a little bit better person. And if that's not what we're reading for, I don't know. Anyway, thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time. All right, I hope you loved that discussion. I'm going to head to the end of the book to 5 random places where I found a quote that I absolutely loved, and we're going to spend a couple minutes going over some principles. This is a super important skill that you need in order to ground your life on the truth. John Quincy Adams told his son that if he didn't place his life on principles, that there would be many opportunities for his passions to control him, and he needed principles with which to govern his life. So we know that we want this skill. We know that we need to be more principle-centered in our approach to life, and that will bring us greater happiness and success and fulfillment. So I've got this Barnes & Noble Classics copy. If you've got that copy, the page numbers might align, but I am in the section called The Game Made. And this is a conversation where the banker, Laurie, is talking to Darnay, and it's near the end when Darnay's going to sacrifice himself. Spoiler alert there, but doesn't matter. The book is still gorgeous. You're still going to love it because, like I always say, you need to know the plot before you read the novel so you can have a better experience. Anyway, so they're having this conversation, and Laurie is talking about, if he were to die, he's a bachelor, so there wouldn't be anyone there to love him or to mourn him. And Sidney Carton is like, "Are you kidding? You would have this whole family that adores you." And he says, "Oh yes, thank you." And he says, this is Sidney, "If you could say with truth to your own solitary heart tonight, I have secured to myself the love and attachment, the gratitude or respect of no human creature. I have won myself a tender place in no regard. I have done nothing good or serviceable to be remembered by. Your 78 years would be 78 heavy curses, would they not?" And he says, "You say truly, Mr. Carton. I think that they would be." So I love this question, basically, that Carton poses to Mr. Laurie, because that's how he feels about his life. that he spent so much of his life not doing things that truly serviced mankind, not building deep, meaningful relationships, not giving up his own passions for something higher and more noble. And so the principle that I wrote that lies underneath this quote that's so meaningful, this question that he asks, is that each good service we do builds our character and brings us comfort of a life well lived. Because that's basically what he's saying to Lori, the opposite of that. If you hadn't done any of those things, wouldn't it be a heavy burden on your heart? But instead, you can say that you're a man of character and that you have lived a valuable life and you don't have that burden. Your burden is lifted with the knowledge that you've given yourself to others. Okay, here comes another one. This is this is Sidney Carton again, and he's walking the streets waiting for the new day to come. And he knows what he needs to do, what the sacrifice that he needs to make, and it's bearing heavily on his heart. And so here's what happens. The hours went on as he walked to and fro, and the clock struck the numbers he would never hear again. 9 gone forever, 10 gone forever, 11 gone forever, 12 coming on to pass away. After a hard contest with that eccentric action of thought, which had last perplexed him, he had got the better of it. He walked up and down, softly repeating their names to himself. The worst of the strife was over. He could walk up and down, free from distracting fancies, praying for himself and for them. So I love this so much because he has to master his own fears and doubts and worries. He has to control his thoughts. And the method that he uses here points us in the direction of a principle. He reminds himself of the good that he plans to do, of the worthiness of the action, and he spends his time praying for himself and praying for the people that he will be sacrificing himself for. And of course, we can do this in any circumstance. When we're having a hard time in any relationship, we can pray for ourselves to be able to forgive, to overcome, to have more patience, more discipline, whatever it is that we need. And we can pray for the people that we want to help, and that will calm our minds and bring us peace. So the principle that I wrote for this one is that praying for ourselves and others helps us overcome our doubts and fears. Another one, this is Madame Defarge. And one of the things that I teach my students is to look for good examples and bad examples. There's several tools that I give, especially in the second level of the academies when we're working on love of truth. There's several tools that you can use for finding principles, but we're just going to this one, that's your favorite quotes. But you can do the inverse. So you can find good examples or you can find bad examples, and you can find principles that are the inverse of that bad example. So in this case, this is a bad example. This is Madame Defarge, who has played a huge role in instigating the revolution, and because of bad things that happened in her past and pain that she had in her past. So it says, but imbued from her childhood with a brooding sense of wrong, which she was deeply wronged, and she brooded on it. Now that was the part that was a choice. This brooding sense of wrong and an inveterate hatred of a class, which she also nursed, opportunity had developed her into a tigress. She was absolutely without pity. If she ever had the virtue in her, it had quite gone out of her. And so a principle that I wrote to go along with this section that really stood out to me was choosing resentment and revenge stills our natural empathy and virtue. So it's the opposite of what's happening to her. She's a woman who has nursed her resentments and has actively sought revenge, and it has distorted her character. It has made her into a tigress without natural human empathy and without other virtues as well that would make her softer, more feminine, more beautiful, and just a better person all around, which of course we can compare to Lucy as her foil. There's a lot of that going on in the book as well. Okay, 2 more. Thought I'd just give you a good sampling here. This is Miss Pross, who is a devoted servant to Lucy and the family. And it is the end of the book, and the intruder has come in, and Miss Pross has been left. She's there to defend the family. And she's this older woman. She's she's an awesome character. And so she's saying to this intruder, they can't speak each other's languages because Miss Pross only speaks English and the intruder only speaks French. So she says, I am a Briton. I am desperate. I don't care an English twopence for myself. I know that the longer I keep you here, the greater hope there is for my ladybird. And that's who she calls Lucy because she just adores her. I'll not leave a handful of that dark hair upon your head if you lay a finger on me. So I just loved what she said there. It stood out to me. I marked it. And there's definitely a principle we can glean there as we look into why is she so powerful? As we ask better questions, the 5 types of questions, which if you go get the True Seeker Starter Kit, it's in there. These 5 types of questions really help us because I can look at this quote and I can say, well, what's a knowledge question? What's happening? Well, she's completely devoted to this woman. And what does that mean? It means that in this moment where her life is being threatened, she has incredible courage. She doesn't even care about her own life. She cares about something more than her own life. There's something, and there's actually multiple principles you could probably delineate from that there are some things worth dying for that are more important than life. The principle that I wrote for this is sacrificing for others gives us confidence and courage. That's what she has. She absolutely knows she's in the right, and she has such incredible courage to defend the family at the risk of her own life. And then one last one. This is kind of Dickens. It's kind of an author's narrative on some of the things that are happening. And it says, he's talking about the guillotine and France, and he says, crush humanity out of shape once more under similar hammers, and it will twist itself into the same tortured forms. Sow the same seed of rapacious license and oppression over again, and it will surely yield the same fruit according to its kind. So there's a lot of beautiful things in there. We could look up words and meanings of words, but we know that what he's saying is that when you do the same actions, they always have the same fruits. That if you were to repeat the same kinds of things that were going on in France somewhere else, you would have a similar falling out. And even though this kind of thing was not done in an aristocratic model, it was definitely done in a communist model, that some people were placed above as of more valued others, and those people didn't value human life, and they sacrificed people for their cause, for the ideology. So there's several principles we could glean from there, asking knowledge questions about what was happening here, what's the circumstance, and a meaning question. Why is he saying this? Why does it matter so much? Why would those things happen again? It's a warning. So by asking that knowledge and meaning question, it leads us to that principle, and then we can ask those last 2 questions, interdisciplinary and application. In this case, I'll glean the principle, choices are attached to consequences. With our choices, we choose the fruits. The same choices will lead the same place. So those are some of the beautiful principles. There's dozens that can be gleaned from this book. And again, you can say one principle a myriad of ways. That's why we write actionable principles. We just want them to lend themselves to actual things we could do in the real world. Like, for example, choosing resentment steals my natural empathy. If I remember that principle, I'm going to be more likely to be super invested in forgiveness and to recognize that I've got to unlock my own heart and open up the flood of empathy that can build quality relationships for me if I will get over those resentments. And there's other principles around that. Or each good service I do brings comfort of a life well lived. So that makes me want to serve more, because I realize that I will have, as I grow older, I will have the comfort of knowing the good things, the good choices that I made, and they will bring me joy continually throughout the rest of my life and beyond. So these principles we can find real applications for. We can bring them to our everyday life. And in this way, the things that we spend our time with really do rub off on us. They are nurturing our divine conscience. They are making us more than we were. And they are sculpting us into the kind of people that we want to become. Truly virtuous, truly good, seeking out the good, the true, and the beautiful, and having a positive impact on the people around us. So that's A Tale of Two Cities. Can't recommend it enough. Curl up, with the fire this winter time over these holidays and give it a listen. Get through those first few chapters. Go to the video that I've linked where I talk about the other, where how to get through the first few chapters and get through them so that you can get this book through you. And it can be one of the books that nurtures your soul, that you return to for healing and for hope, and that elevates you and makes you want to be a better person. Thanks so much for joining me and Lindsey and Kim today, and I'll see you next time.